The history of philosophy in Poland parallels the evolution of philosophy in Europe in general. Polish philosophy drew upon the broader currents of European philosophy, and in turn contributed to their growth. Among the most momentous Polish contributions were made, in the 13th century, by the scholastic philosopher and scientist Witelo, and, in the 16th century, by the Renaissance polymath Niklaus Copernicus. Subsequently, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth partook in the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment, which for the multi-ethnic Commonwealth ended not long after the partitions and political annihilation that would last for the next 123 years, until the collapse of the three partitioning empires in World War I. The period of Messianism, between the November 1830 and January 1863 uprisings, reflected European romantic and idealist trends, as well as a Polish yearning for political resurrection. It was a period of maximalist metaphysical systems. The collapse of the January 1863 uprising prompted an agonizing reappraisal of Poland's situation. Poles gave up their earlier practice of measuring their resources by their aspirations, and buckled down to hard work and study. A positivist, wrote the novelist Bolesław Prue's friend, Julian Okorowicz, was anyone who bases assertions on verifiable evidence, who does not express himself categorically about doubtful things, and does not speak at all about those that are inaccessible. The 20th century brought a new quickening to Polish philosophy. There was growing interest in Western philosophical currents. Rigorously trained Polish philosophers made substantial contributions to specialized fields, to psychology, the history of philosophy, the theory of knowledge, and especially mathematical logic. Jan Łukasiewicz gained world fame with his concept of many-valued logic, and his Polish notation. Alfred Tarski's work in truth theory won him world renown. After World War II, for over 4 decades, world-class Polish philosophers and historians of philosophy such as Władysław Tartakiewicz continued their work, often in the face of adversities occasioned by the dominance of a politically enforced official philosophy. The phenomenologist Roman Ingarden did influential work in aesthetics and in a hustle-style metaphysics. His student, Karol Wojtyła, acquired a unique influence on the world stage as Pope John Paul II. Scholasticism. The formal history of philosophy in Poland may be said to have begun in the 15th century. Following the revival of the University of Krakow by King Władysław II Jagiello in 1400, the true beginnings of Polish philosophy, however, reach back to the 13th century in Witelo, a Silesian born to a Polish mother and a Thuringian settler, a contemporary of Thomas Aquinas who had spent part of his life in Italy at centers of the highest intellectual culture. In addition to being a philosopher, he was a scientist who specialized in optics. His famous treatise, Perspectiva, while drawing on the Arabic Book of Optics by Al-Hasan, was unique in Latin literature, and in turn helped inspire Roger Bacon's best work, Part 5 of his Opus Maius, on perspectival science, as well as his supplementary treatise on the multiplication of vision. Witelo's Perspectiva additionally made important contributions to psychology. It held that vision per se apprehends only colors in light, while all else, particularly the distance and size of objects, is established by means of association and unconscious deduction. Witelo's concept of being was one rare in the Middle Ages, neither Augustinian as among conservatives nor Aristotelian as among progressives, but Neoplatonist. It was an emanationist concept that held radiation to be the prime characteristic of being, and ascribed to radiation the nature of light. This metaphysic of light inclined Witelo to optical research, or perhaps vice versa. His optical studies led to his metaphysic. According to the Polish historian of philosophy, Władysław Tartakiewicz, no Polish philosopher since Witelo has enjoyed so eminent a European standing as this thinker, who belonged, in a sense, to the prehistory of Polish philosophy. From the beginning of the 15th century, Polish philosophy, centered at Kraków University, pursued a normal course. It no longer harbored exceptional thinkers such as Witelo, but it did feature representatives of all wings of mature scholasticism, via Antiqua as well as via Moderna. The first of these to reach Kraków was via Moderna, then the more widespread movement in Europe. In physics, logic and ethics, Determinism prevailed in Kraków, under the influence of the French scholastic, Jean Buridan, who had been rector of the University of Paris and an exponent of views of William of Ockham. Buridan had formulated the theory of impetus, the force that causes a body, once set in motion, to persist in motion, and stated that impetus is proportional to the speed and amount of matter comprising a body. Buridan thus anticipated Galileo and Isaac Newton. His theory of impetus was momentous in that it also explained the motions of celestial bodies without resort to the spirits, intelligentiae, to which the Peripatetics had ascribed those motions. At Kraków, physics was now expounded by Jan Canty, who developed this concept of impetus. A general trait of the Kraków scholastics was a proclivity for compromise, for reconciling nominalism with the older tradition. For example, the nominalist, Benedict Hess, while in principle accepting the theory of impetus, did not apply it to the heavenly spheres. In the second half of the 15th century, at Kraków, via Antiqua became dominant. Nominalism retreated, and the old scholasticism triumphed. In this period, Thomism had its chief center at Cologne, whence it influenced Kraków. Cologne, formerly the home ground of Albertus Magnus, had preserved Albert's mode of thinking. Thus the Cologne philosophers formed two wings, the Thomist and Albertist. The chief Kraków adherents of the Cologne-style Thomism included Jan of Glogau and Jakub of Gostynin. Another, pure teacher of Thomism was Michał Falconer of Wrocław. Almost at the same time, Scotism appeared in Poland, having been brought from Paris first by Michał Torog of Bystryków. Torog had studied at Paris in 1473–77, in the period when, following the anathematization of the nominalists, the Scottish school was there enjoying its greatest triumphs. A prominent student of Torog's, Jan of Stobnica, was already a moderate Scotist who took account of the theories of the Occamists, Thomists and Humanists. When nominalism was revived in Western Europe at the turn of the 16th century, particularly thanks to Jacques Lefebvre d'Étaples, it presently reappeared in Kraków and began taking the upper hand there once more over Thomism and Scotism. It was reintroduced particularly by Lefebvre's pupil, Jan Silling, a native of Kraków who had studied at Paris in the opening years of the 16th century. Another follower of Lefebvre's was Grzegorz of Storyszyn, a Kraków professor who, beginning in 1510, published the Frenchman's works at Kraków. Thus Poland had made her appearance as a separate philosophical center only at the turn of the 15th century, at a time when the creative period of scholastic philosophy had already passed. Throughout the 15th century, Poland harbored all the currents of scholasticism. The advent of humanism in Poland would find a scholasticism more vigorous than in other countries. Indeed, scholasticism would survive the 16th and 17th centuries and even part of the 18th at Kraków and Wilno universities and at numerous Jesuit, Dominican and Franciscan colleges. To be sure, in the 16th century, with the arrival of the Renaissance, scholasticism would enter upon a decline, but during the 17th century's Counter-Reformation, and even into the early 18th century, scholasticism would again become Poland's chief philosophy. Renaissance. The spirit of humanism, which had reached Poland by the middle of the 15th century, was not very philosophical. Rather, it lent its stimulus to linguistic studies, political thought, and scientific research. But these manifested a philosophical attitude different from that of the previous period. Empirical natural science had flourished at Kraków as early as the 15th century, side by side with speculative philosophy. The most perfect product of this blossoming was Niklaus Copernicus. He was not only a scientist but a philosopher. According to Tartakovich, he may have been the greatest, in any case, the most renowned, philosopher that Poland ever produced. He drew the inspiration for his cardinal discovery from philosophy. He had become acquainted through Marsilia Ficino with the philosophies of Plato and the Pythagoreans, and through the writings of the philosophers Cicero and Plutarch he had learned about the ancients who had declared themselves in favor of the Earth's movement. Copernicus may also have been influenced by Krakow philosophy. During his studies there, determinist physics had been taught, with special emphasis on impetus. His own thinking was guided by philosophical considerations. He arrived at a heliocentric thesis, ratione posti equidem sensu. It was not observation but the discovery of a logical contradiction in Ptolemy's system that served him as a point of departure that led to the new astronomy. In his dedication to Pope Paul III, he submitted his work for judgment by philosophers. In its turn, Copernicus' theory transformed man's view of the structure of the universe, and of the place held in it by the earth and by man, and thus attained a far-reaching philosophical importance. Copernicus was involved not only in natural science and natural philosophy but also, by his postulation of a quantity theory of money and of Gresham's law, in the philosophy of man. In the early 16th century, Plato, who had become a model for philosophy in Italy, especially in Medici and Florence, was represented in Poland in some ways by Adam Awlowicz, author of Conversations about Immortality. Generally speaking, though, Poland remained Aristotelian. Sebastian Petri-Psí of Pilsner laid stress, in the theory of knowledge, on experiment and induction, and in psychology, on feeling and will, while in politics he preached democratic ideas. Petri-Psí's central feature was his linking of philosophical theory with the requirements of practical national life. With Petri-Psí, vernacular Polish philosophical terminology began to develop not much later than did the French and German. Yet another Renaissance current, the New Stoicism, was represented in Poland by Jakub Górski, author of a famous dialectic and of many works in grammar, rhetoric, theology and sociology. He tended toward eclecticism, attempting to reconcile the Stoics with Aristotle. A later, purer representative of Stoicism in Poland was Adam Bursky, author of a Dialectica Ciceronis, boldly proclaiming Stoic sensualism and empiricism in, before Francis Bacon, urging the use of inductive method. A star among the pleiade of progressive political philosophers during the Polish Renaissance was Andrzej Frycz-Modzewski, who advocated on behalf of equality for all before the law, the accountability of monarch and government to the nation, and social assistance for the weak and disadvantaged. His chief work was De Republica Emendana. Another notable political thinker was Wawrzyniec Grimala Gozlicki, best known in Poland and abroad for his book De Optimo Senator. It propounded the view, which for long got the book banned in England, as subversive of monarchy, that a ruler may legitimately govern only with the sufferance of the people. After the first decades of the 17th century, the wars, invasions and internal dissensions that beset the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth brought a decline in philosophy. If in the ensuing period there was independent philosophical thought, it was among the religious dissenters, particularly the Polish Arians, also known variously as anti-Trinitarians, Socinians, and Polish Brethren, forerunners of the British and American Socinians, Unitarians and Deists, who were to figure prominently in the intellectual and political currents of the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. The Polish dissenters created an original ethical theory radically condemning evil and violence. Centers of intellectual life such as that at Leszno hosted notable thinkers such as the Czech pedagogue Jan Amos Kamensky, and the Pole, Jan Johnston. Johnston was tutor and physician to the Leszczyński family, a devotee of Bacon and experimental knowledge, and author of Natura Constantia. published in Amsterdam in 1632, whose geometrical method and naturalistic, almost pantheistic concept of the world may have influenced Benedict Spinoza. The Leszczynski family itself would produce an 18th-century Polish-Lithuanian king, Stanislaw Leszczynski, le philosophe bienfaisant, in fact, an independent thinker whose views on culture were in advance of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's, and who was the first to introduce into Polish intellectual life on a large scale the French influences that were later to become so strong. In 1689, in an exceptional miscarriage of justice, a Polish ex-Jesuit philosopher, Kazimierz Leszczynski, author of a manuscript treatise, the Non-Existentia Dei, was accused of atheism by a priest who was his debtor, was convicted, and was executed in most brutal fashion.